All right, friends, welcome back to our digital workflow. Now that we have been through Lightroom and selected our original RAW files, we're now going to move over into Photoshop and start building out a beautiful panoramic. So let's get started. All right, friends, welcome to yet another Photoshop lesson. In this episode, we will be building out a beautiful panoramic aspen forest. Let's do a quick recap before we get started. So when we drop back into Lightroom, these are the 3 raw assets that we generated using the development module. We have a left panel, a center panel, and a right panel. We basically went into these raw files and did some fundamental color toning and a little bit of curve toning. And honestly, they didn't really take a great deal of editing because of all of the beautiful flat light that was showering down through the forest thanks to our wonderful cloudy day. All right. Let's get on over into Photoshop and put these babies together so we can see what they really look like as a finished product. So, File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, Browse. I've already sort of preloaded these images. We're going to grab all 4 of these files. There is an extra file, and we'll get to that one in just a little bit, but that's okay. All right, so as you can see over in our Layers palette, we now have 4 images that are stacked up in a single Photoshop document. Now we're going to worry about this top file a little bit later on. I'm going to just turn him off for now. And right now we're going to focus on our initial 3 images that we will be using to build out this panorama. So I'm going to hit the F key, go to full screen. That way I can move this around. And the first thing we need to do is create the proper canvas size. So image, canvas size. I'm just going to guesstimate here. I'll throw this up at about 60 inches wide. It's not the widest panel that we've done, but that should pretty much get us close. All right, so we now have a nice wide canvas that we can use to build our images out. Now, the first thing that I like to do is I like to select a color, a prominent color in the color palette here. So I'm just going to use the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to select one of these sort of kind of middle yellows here. And then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm just going to call this back. Next, we're going to grab our paint bucket tool, and I'm just going to fill this entire layer with one solid color. Now the reason I like to do this, I'm going to drag this all the way down to the bottom. The reason that I like to do this is because in Photoshop's native state, it has this sort of checkered transparency grid in the background. And as we start to move these images around and change their opacity, that checker grid comes out underneath. And I find it to be a little bit distracting. I find it to be difficult to kind of see what I'm doing with that checker grid on. So with our freshly created back layer, we can actually just sort of mitigate that checker grid. It takes it out of the equation and it makes it a little bit easier for us to see what we're doing. Just a matter of personal preference. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I tend to like to kind of get rid of that checker grid or at least hide it so that I can tell what I'm doing. All right, first things first. Let's just move these files around a little bit to get a quick and dirty idea about how they line up. So the first thing I did is I moved my left file over into the left quadrant. Next, I'm going to grab my central file and move him around until I feel like he matches up pretty nicely. Now, right now I'm looking at this little evergreen tree and this little evergreen tree, both of which occur in each image because we have overlap. So I'm just going to move that tree to where it kind of looks like it matches up basically there. Next, we'll move down to our final layer on the right, and we'll move him around. I'm looking at the tops of these little leaves right here and the tops of these little leaves right here. That looks like about where those guys line up. We'll do some fine tuning in just a minute, but as you can see, with one quick step, we can really start to see what our panoramic is going to look like. Now, I consider this to be an absolutely spectacular scene. Where else in the world are you going to see these beautiful evergreen trees growing straight vertically up and down to where they are somehow simultaneously crisscrossed with these universally slanting aspens all going at a diagonal? I've never seen anything like it. I think it's extraordinary, and I'm really excited to be able to share this with you today. All right, so let's jump right in. Basically what we need to do is we need to line these layers up a little bit more perfectly so that when we start our layer masking, we do in fact have a good way to stitch them together. So let's start with our image up here on the left. I'm gonna go to 50% so that I can see through the layer onto the layer underneath. Then I'm gonna target my central layer right here. And let's just zoom in a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to look for an area where these two images really kind of come together. Now there is a whole lot of information going on right here, but I feel like I'm kind of focusing in on this little section right here. There's a lot of good overlap happening right there. Let's just grab our move tool, and I'm just going to use the arrow keys on the keyboard to nudge these images until they pretty much line up. So this looks pretty close right here. They're not going to line up 1,000,000% because I was standing in the forest. I was kind of on a rocky slope, a little bit unsettled, kind of holding on for dear life. I did the best I could to level out my tripod and shoot these as closely as I could, but I feel like this is going to get us pretty darn close. I might actually be able to use this little evergreen tree to line these guys up a little better. That might be the way to go right there. So let's focus in on this region right here. I'm going to drag a guide, and we're going to look at this little evergreen tree as a pretty good location for these two files to come together. The evergreen tree from the top file is matching up with the evergreen tree from the file underneath rather nicely. And as we move to the left of the line, the trees sort of separate and blur apart. As we move to the right of the line, they once again separate and blur apart. So this right here is going to be pretty much our nodal access point where the two images overlap very, very nicely. So let's zoom back out and let's create a basic, we'll bring this guy back up to 100%, and I'm just going to use a basic layer mask on him. And what we're going to do is we're going to mask out everything to the right of our guide, and that should allow our images to line up just beautifully. So I'm going to make sure that my mask is selected. I'm going to use a brush tool, and I'm going to switch over to black paint. We're going to go to 100%, and I'm just going to come over here, and I'm going to paint this layer out. Now right now I don't need to be looking all the way across at my final layer, so let's just close that one down to eliminate this right now. And all I want to do is look at this layer here. So here we go. We are painting away the top left layer and revealing the central layer underneath. I'm going to use the left bracket key to make my brush size a little bit smaller. We're going to paint a little bit closer to that guideline. I don't want to go over it too much. Next, I'm going to use the right and left bracket key, make my brush bigger. The left makes it smaller, and to the right of that, the backslash key enables my quick mask. This basically gives me a quick idea of how I'm painting my mask, because some of these forest scenes, it's really difficult to tell where one image ends and the other image begins. But we do want to make sure that we do a good job, because as we zoom in, you can start to see there's a lot of ghosting happening right through here. A lot of places where the branches don't line up. And that's definitely a very good way to get yourself caught in how you stitch together your panoramics. If you were to print this extra large for a gallery or a hotel or for your house, you want to make sure that your stitch lines are really, really tight and accurate. So again, I'm on my mask. I have a brush with black paint at 100%. We're zooming in a little bit closer here, and I'm just going to try to start fine-tuning this image so that these guys come together a little bit easier around the nodal point, and we don't have any egregious sort of ghosting or cloning going on. Now again, these aspen forests are beautiful because they just have so much detail and so much information. Let's use our quick mask to make sure, yeah, we're kind of on the right track. These aspen forests, they have so much detail and so much information that it does make it a relatively easier for us to kind of hide our editing in the detail. There's a lot of camouflage that I can use throughout this scene in order to kind of hide my stitching lines, because I want my stitching lines to be very, very accurate and very natural. I don't want the audience to be able to look in close and say, oh yeah, I can see where he kind of stitched that together. Now we have to be careful, because as we have diagonal elements crossing our nodal axis, they're going to get a little tricky. So this is just where you have to use a little bit of artistic license and just be careful in how you paint these guys together. See, right now I've already disconnected this little black branch right here, so I'm just going to go in a little closer and artistically kind of noodle him over just a bit. Put this back on, and you can kind of fudge it a little bit at times. Now this is, of course, hand painting can in fact be a little bit of a tedious process, and I understand that for people who don't really enjoy editing, there are lots of automation tools, and in many of our earlier episodes, we talked about the automation that you can use to kind of automatically generate these panoramic files. I personally do not like them because I find them to be far less accurate than what we can do ourselves. But that's just me. Some people really don't like getting into the nitty-gritty and editing their images to this degree. I personally find that editing my images to this degree actually just generates a vastly superior product and an incredibly high quality product. So I'm kind of in a world where I produce images for very discerning clients. We have luxury homes, we have hotels, we have galleries, and so I can't really afford to allow software to do all of my creative thinking for me. I have to get in here and make sure to a very close degree that my files are excellent all the way down to the little nitty-gritty. Because, you know, when you are in the gallery scene and when you're in the hotel scene, you're definitely going to have other photographers coming up to your images because they're printed 7 feet wide, and they're going to be looking at them up close, and they're going to be just searching, scrutinizing for any little mistake that they can, so that they can say, "Ha! I found out where this guy stitched this together." And you don't want to give these punks the satisfaction of finding your edits. Nah, I'm just kidding. Most people are actually pretty nice about this stuff. But at the same time, I get to be very neurotic on how my images come together. So once again, you can see here, this little baby branch and this little baby branch do not line up. So let's go over just a little bit more, and it kind of looks like we found a leaf that we can use to hide them. I don't think anyone's ever going to notice. All right, coming down, let's check our quick mask again. Let's get in here. Again, lots of really good leaves that I can use to sort of hide my edits together. Maybe there was a tiny little bit of wind blowing through the forest and causing some of these leaves to sort of blur out a little bit. Blurry leaves are not the end of the world. They're actually pretty good at allowing us to kind of hide our edits. Again, these leaves here are a little bit closer in the foreground. They're kind of getting out of focus, and out of focus leaves are also another really great way for you to hide your edits. Okay. Let's zoom out just a little bit, and I'm going to turn this central layer off so that I can get a little closer look and make sure I don't have any ghosts or artifacts, which I obviously do. So let's zoom in just a little bit here, grab our brush tool once again, and just make sure that I'm brushing out all of those little ghost artifacts that got lost as I was making that transition. Okay, that looks pretty darn good. That looks like a pretty good clean edit. Let's zoom out just a little bit, and we'll turn our central layer on, and then we'll come on over here and turn this guy on. So the next thing we need to do is line up our central layer with our right layer. So central layer goes to 50%, so I can see through it down to this layer, and then I'm going to grab this layer and start moving him around until I find what looks more or less like a nodal point. I'm looking at this tree right here where all of the bark just lines up beautifully right here in the center, and I think that's going to be just about where we need to focus our efforts. Nudge him over just a tad, and right about there, this looks like a pretty good place to start. So this is where our images are going to come together most naturally, and this is where we should be able to paint the most seamless mask in order to get these guys to work out beautifully. You know, let's double check that because it does look fairly accurate right here as well. That's okay. We'll just stick with this right here because that's the first guide that we put in. All right, let's bring central layer up to 100%, and I basically want to give him yet another layer mask. Let's go with a brush tool, black paint at 100%. Zoom out just a little bit, and I'm really having a difficult time. Even with no masking, I'm having a difficult time figuring out where one layer ends and the other layer begins. So just for us to get started, I'm going to turn this guy off. And now I can see that everything from the guide over to the end of the image, that's what we need to remove with our mask. So let's just paint that out really quick. Make this a little smaller, come down in through here. That looks pretty good. And now when I turn this guy on, I can get back onto my mask, I can zoom in, and we can really try to do a good job of accurately bringing these two images together. Again, I got lots of good camouflage working for me. So let's get up here in these leaves, staying mostly to the right of the guide as best that I can. Lots of good leaf camouflage, and this is looking like a pretty good edit. Use the quick mask to check. Very nice, very nice. And as the back of the forest tends to fall out of focus, you know, because this image was shot at 88 millimeters at f11. Now, that should give you a pretty expansive depth of field in order to get some of these critical trees in focus and nice and sharp. But again, as the rest of the aspen forest disappears into the distance, especially at a longer focal length, some of these trees back here are not going to be 100% razor sharp. And that's okay, because they're basically providing some interesting looking background information. And it also makes it a little bit easier for me to kind of do my dirty work and get in here and paint these panoramic panels together. That all looks pretty good. This image comes together nicely right through here. Again, we're kind of on that nodal point where the two images overlap just perfectly. Coming down. Just got to be careful. Our tree is kind of, some of the bark doesn't line up perfectly, but again, that's probably okay. I'm not going to stress that too much. And let's see here. I'm actually switched back over to white paint, and I'm coming down and I'm revealing my central layer in this case, because I feel like as we get a little bit farther away, we can take some artistic license, kind of use this tree to sort of blockade most of our edits. So again, right now I have white paint and I am revealing the leftmost layer. Let's take a look at that. So as you can see, the left layer is starting to encroach a little bit over here. And that's just because I'm following these diagonal tree lines down, because it just feels a little bit more natural for me right now. So let's make this guy a little bit bigger. Come on down through here. And again, you know, when you hand paint your panoramas together, it's a little bit up to you to just sort of kind of use your imagination. You got to use a little bit of instinct when you're kind of building these files out. As we get closer to the bottom, again, I've got a lot of really wonderful leaf camouflage that I can hide my edits in. The leaves that are closer to the camera are also starting to fall out of focus just a little bit, because it was such a long telephoto lens. And, you know, maybe they're a little bit out of focus. Maybe they are blowing in the wind just a little bit. Either way, we want this to look nice and natural. So we come in here, grab a little bit of this tree. That looks good right through there. You gotta be careful. Let's switch back to black paint. We'll just kind of paint that individual leaf in as sort of a last result. Paint a little bit of bark right there. And again, nature is organic. Nature is constantly moving. It is made up of organic shapes, rounds, circles, curves, all kinds of things. There are very few straight lines, unless you have a beautifully straight aspen tree. There are very few straight lines that are going to get us in trouble when we are trying to mask these images together. And I've got a little bit of a clone going on right there. That's okay, we'll get rid of him. And as for the rest of it, I'm looking at it up close and I'm having a hard time telling where one image comes together and the other one stops. So we've sort of followed this tree up our kind of masking line, and then we've gone in and kind of gotten in and just we've gone straight up from there. All right, let's back up a little bit. So our mask kind of took a little bit of a detour. It followed this diagonal tree off in that direction, and that's okay, because again, nature is organic, and we do have lots of diagonal lines happening in this image, so I wouldn't expect to just be able to create a straight up and down mask every single time. All right, let us turn this guy off and see if we have any artifacts. We do. We've got some ghosting happening. So again, back to my original mask here. Whoopsie, wrong side. Let's switch back to black paint. White paint was revealing. We want to use black paint to hide, and that looks pretty good right there. No more ghosts. There's a little bit of ghost right there. And that looks like a pretty good edit to me. All right, let's turn this guy back on. And we should now have, with these three files here, you can see them. We start up on the left, then we move down to our central file, and then we move off to the right. They're kind of stacked in this diagonal. And we have basically used that to create a beautiful, seamless image. All right, so we didn't quite use all of our canvas. The first thing I'm gonna do is just crop that section out so that I'm not being distracted by it. So I'm just gonna grab a marquee tool. Let's start that over. Let's grab a marquee tool and we'll zoom out just a little bit. And I'm just gonna grab the entire canvas like this. We'll go over a little bit, then we can zoom in. Again, with the marquee tool selected, I can use the arrow key to nudge that marquee over just a little bit so we can preserve all of the pixels that we shot. I'm just gonna go up to an image crop. And basically what this will do is it just effectively crops the image down to that full size. Alrighty, Now this is a pretty darn good edit. I'm gonna remove my guide so I can kind of get a little bit of a creative assessment of what we've got here. So we do have this beautiful spruce tree rising up through the center of our image. It kind of looks like this obelisk right down the middle, so it does provide a pretty good amount of balance. One thing I'm noticing is this kind of massive exposure burnout over here. We've got this, let's zoom in a little bit. We've got these gnarly branches in the foreground. They're very distinctly out of focus. Some of them are kind of encroaching in on our scene. And this is just the nature of the forest. Things get overgrown. You don't always have full access to everything that you want to kind of capture in your image. And we definitely have some massive exposure burnouts happening up here in the top left corner. Now what that's doing from a compositional standpoint is that is drawing the viewer's eye away from the scene. It's just this huge blob of light up here, and it's distracting, and it's making people leave the image out that top left corner. I don't want people to leave this image. I want them to stay inside this image. I want them to explore inside this image. I want them to be fascinated with all of these beautiful listing aspen trees. So what we need to do, there's two things. We can either crop that out entirely, or we can do plan B, which is to patch that up a little bit. Now I took the liberty, if we'll notice over here, I took the liberty of grabbing an additional file. I did shoot this scene a number of times. Let's turn all of these guys off. I did shoot this scene a number of times using a number of different focal lengths. So this is basically the same scene shot at, I don't know, maybe 10 millimeters less, so maybe 70 millimeters versus the original 88 millimeters. And so I have a bit of a wider version of the exact same scene. This gives me kind of a unique perspective on this little cluster of trees up here that I might just be able to use to kind of patch this ugly looking hole up here. So consider this top image to be a patch. Let's go ahead and call it that. And I'm going to use a little bit of foliage from this patch to try and cover up all of that craziness that's going on up in that top left corner. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of like, I'm focusing in on this sort of big green area right here, which is again these same trees, only at a slightly different focal length and a slightly different angle. So they don't look completely identical. I'm not kind of like just blasting some big blob or a clone stamp up here to where it just looks completely cloned. I do have the same trees at a slightly different angle so that they will match their contemporaries in the original image and be slightly different enough so that the viewer doesn't pick up a pattern that things have been cloned over. So let's just kind of, again, I'm focusing in on this section right here, and I'm just going to kind of move it up into that top corner. And hopefully what we can do is just mask that in so that we're no longer left with this giant blob of exposure burnout that lets the audience leave the side of the image. So I'm going to do a reverse mask. So an option mask on our patch, basically that fills the entire scene with black paint so that I can come back in here and I can grab a brush tool with white paint at 100%, and I can just kind of brush my extra foliage up in that corner. And because, again, it is the same trees, just from a slightly different angle and a slightly different focal length, they do naturally match the scene without looking extra clone stamped. Now we don't have guys lining up all that well over here, so I can actually just sort of grab this guy and let's nudge him over until maybe he does sort of match this one tree right here. Let's go back to our mask, back to our brush tool, make him a little bit smaller, get in and just kind of see if we can, I don't know, maybe we just grew a whole new aspen tree right there. I'll bring these guys up. And we do still have some kind of gnarly looking trees in the foreground here. I'm going to leave those for now because I think we might do just a little bit of cropping to kind of take that left edge out of the equation just a little bit. But again, I'm just sort of brushing these brand new trees in here. This guy might be a little bit problematic. We're going to have to be careful with him because he just sort of started growing out of nowhere. From here to the top, he's a tree, and from here to the bottom, he's basically a ghost. So let's see if we can't maybe build him in just a little bit and potentially hide him. Oh, look at there. He hides behind some foliage naturally, just like that. We got pretty lucky on that one. I did not plan that. But that's okay. That's the beauty of kind of taking a little bit of artistic license and trying to really, really produce the best possible image that you can produce. Let's see what our quick mask looks like here. All right, again, it's organic. It's sort of flowing all over the place. This area we might need to focus in on a little bit. Yep, our tree is kind of ghosting his way into this area. So I'm just gonna bring him in a little bit more here. Again, we've got foliage to kind of cover these guys. Let's just grab a couple of leaves in here and just say the forest is so dense that we don't even see this aspen tree until he shows up right up there. I don't think anyone's going to know too much. Okay, so again, we've got some nice organic shapes kind of coming in and covering our tracks, as it were. Bring this guy down just a tad. And again, all of this is happening in the top left corner, so this ideally is not a major focal point for viewers coming in and looking at this scene. Let's just maybe see how we did. Paint a tiny little bit more. Oh, we've just grown a whole new tree. I'm going to be careful about that. Ease back on that. Alrighty. Okay, so things are looking pretty good over there. And now when we look at our overall scene, I'm no longer pulled out of the image by this big blob of overexposed sky and this gnarly looking tree up here. I now just have a regular sort of consistent carpet of forest that allows me to stay safely within the confines. Let's get our move tool up here. It allows me to stay safely within the confines of the image. Again, this big element over here, before we patched it, was super distracting, and it just leads the viewer right out of the scene. I've got all these beautiful aspen trees and they're all kind of pointing, hey, look at this big blob over here. They're pointing to the left. You can leave the scene now. Goodbye. I don't really want to do that. So we have patched our sky up nicely, and we've allowed our viewer to kind of stay within the confines of this image. And we did so without cropping that out. Now, cropping that out, again, would have been the fastest way to take care of that. But like I say, I take special care to shoot these images, and I want to have as much megapixel horsepower as possible. And I want to be able to actually stay true to the original composition as we saw it. All right, that all looks pretty good. There is a lot happening in this image. There are a few other fine-tuning elements I think we can do to it. We can add a little bit of sharpening, do a little bit of color toning. That won't take too long. Let's try to get out of this in about 5 more minutes so that you guys can go off and start making your own creations. All right. All the heavy lifting is out of the way. We have very meticulously stitched this image together, and we've patched up our egregious mistake up in that top left corner. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of sharpening. I want to have a nice, beautiful, sharp image, but not too sharp. Select all, copy merged, and paste. And essentially what we've just done is we have taken all of our edits thus far, and we have pasted them into a single merged image on the top. I'm going to call this sharp. And I'm going to filter this top image as a sharpened layer. Let's go ahead and zoom in nice and close so we can see. It's already a very sharp image. It was shot at f11. I like that, but we can always add just a little extra sharpness. So let's go into our filter and unsharp mask. Again, unsharp mask is a bit of an old school filter, but I have always found it to be very, very successful, and I haven't really changed my parameters much at all. So if you want to write these numbers down or take a screenshot, these numbers have worked for literally almost every single amount of sharpening that I've ever done. That goes for landscapes and portraits and whatever you could want. So let's click OK. And basically what this filter does is it looks for areas of high contrast and it increases that contrast. Now there is an enormous amount of high contrast in this scene, and we have effectively over sharpened our image. It's really looking very, very artificial at this point. And you want to be careful about over sharpening your image because that's the fastest way to give your audience front row tickets to amateur hour. So we need to dial back on this edit a little bit. Right now sharpening is at 100%. So let's go ahead and do another maybe reverse mask. So option mask, we've basically just turned our sharpening off by masking it out. And what I want to do is grab yet another brush tool, and I want to switch to white paint, and I want to go in at about 30% opacity. And let's zoom out so I can look at my entire scene. And I just want to brush a little bit of sharpness into the scene, only where we need it. I don't need to brush sharpness into the background where the forest is already out of focus. That's where you start to get some really artificial looking stuff. But I do want to kind of make sure that some of my aspen trunks are nice and sharp. So let's start with this guy. I'm going to do one brush stroke down him, couple of brushes down these aspens, just kind of following these aspen trees so that when the viewer does look up close to this big, beautiful gallery print, he or she will be able to see all the detail in that beautiful bark. A little bit down in the leaves. I want to be careful about these leaves down here because, again, this stuff over here was much closer to the camera, and when you're shooting at 88 millimeters, almost 90 millimeters, this stuff tends to fall out of focus just a little bit. So we want to be careful about sharpening foreground elements. Like I say, I did focus stack this file initially in camera, but I've never had a whole lot of success in getting super razor sharp leaves in the foreground to match with razor sharp aspen trees in the background. So in this case, we're just going to let this image kind of have a little bit of natural depth of field to it. All right, moving right along, I want to sharpen a little bit. I want to make sure this evergreen tree is nice and good. I'm going to do one quick little brush stroke on a couple of these other guys over on this side. Again, careful about sharpening these foreground elements. Do a little bit there, maybe a little bit down there. Now when I look at my mask, what we can see is that I've very carefully brushed strategic sharpness into very specific parts of my scene. So when I look up close now, basically all of my aspen trunks should be nice and sharp. My evergreen trees should for the most part be nice and sharp. And then we've kind of dialed back on the ultimate amount of sharpness that goes on in these background layers, which are naturally falling out of focus. So let's turn our sharpness off. Let's get a look at an area of high contrast, such as the bark here. So we're going to turn our sharpness off. This is our original, and then when I turn it back on, we get just a tiny little extra punch of sharpness. Like I say, these modern Canon lenses are already incredibly sharp, and we don't want to over sharpen our files because they tend to look very artificial. All right, so there is a huge amount of color information already happening in this image. I don't know that I need to go through and color tone anything, but we'll do just a little bit just in case. I'm seeing some extra green up here and a little bit of green there. We might want to celebrate some of that, and we want to kind of help some of our yellows really pop out as well. So first, let's concentrate on yellow. I'm going to grab a quick color balance. Let's move our yellows up a little bit. Not too much, let's keep it subtle, and I'll add a splash of red just to kind of give it a bit of an orange hue. I'm just going to call this yellow. So we've made the overall image yellow. I'm going to do a Command I and reverse this mask so that all my yellow should disappear. And then I just want to very strategically paint the yellow in areas where I feel like it's a little bit more prominent. So again, brush tool, white paint, 30%. I'm painting on my yellow mask to basically paint in this yellow effect. Paint it in a little bit here, kind of up in the canopy where I'm seeing that the yellow. I don't need to paint it in down here because it's already incredibly prominent across these little kind of scrubby trees at the bottom. They were sort of starting to turn a little bit earlier than the rest of these, but we can add a little bit of yellow up and in here. Again, that's a nice subtle edit. Let's move some over here. We'll grab that guy, a little bit here, a little bit there, and somewhere in around there. All right, good. Some very subtle yellow painting. Let's look into some green. I think we can do the same thing with green. So let's select this top layer. I'm going to create a new adjustment layer using color balance, and we're going to throw in some green. If I bring this all the way to the right, again, I get this electric lime green. We want to be careful about overdoing that. So let's keep it subtle. We'll go up 17, 18 points. We're going to call this green. I'm going to inverse this mask, Command I. All the green disappears because it is now hidden behind the mask. And once again, brush tool, white paint 30%. I'm just going to paint in a little bit of extra green, kind of up here in the corner where the color saturation was starting to kind of fall off a little bit. The color saturation of this file is not fully equal. All of the yellows down here at the bottom are super duper saturated, whereas the aspen trees off in the distance are slightly less saturated, and that is to be expected because this is a bit of a foggy morning and we had a lot of sort of atmospheric conditions higher up in the trees or farther away in the forest that are obstructing that super bright color that we are able to see right here in the foreground. All right, let's turn green off and on. Okay, that gives us just a nice subtle punch of green right over there. Again, I don't want to do too much more to this file because Mother Nature has already created such an enormous amount of content for us. I think the last thing that we're going to do is potentially just throw one quick curves adjustment on. I'm going to make an S curve. Highlights go up, darks go down. This is to give you an idea of the S curve here in the color palette. Basically what we're doing is we're bringing our highlights up, our midtones stay relatively neutral, and our darks go down. Now this is obviously a ridiculous hypercolor version of the scene. We're not gonna allow this edit to stand fast, but basically this is a nice way to sort of parabolically naturally add contrast into your file. We already have an enormous amount of contrast in this file, so we have to be very cautious. Let's bring this edit way down. Let's bring our brights down closer to home. Let's bring our blacks up closer to home. We have a very, very subtle tone curve, and let's see what that looks like on and off. Just a very, very tiny subtle hint of that tonal curve, just for one final little pop of contrast. Alrighty. Now, if I am being perfectly honest, I would say that this image is pretty close to done. I don't know that we need to keep editing this thing. I feel like we've actually got it in a pretty darn good place. I suppose if you were really neurotic, you could kind of get over on this left-hand side and try to clean up some of these branches a little bit more. We don't need to get too meticulous in this particular lesson because I just wanted to kind of show you that we can in fact have the ability to sort of really control our scene much the way a painter would control his scene. So it always pays to shoot sort of extra stock photos of the scene when you're not entirely sure that you have enough to cover everything. All right, let's get one final look. We're gonna zoom in here. We'll hit the F key for our kind of sort of final evaluation look, and I personally feel like this is a really, really beautiful image. Again, it just has such a unique quality to it. Listing aspens all going in a diagonal direction and completely contrasting against the perfectly straight up and down evergreen trees. I just don't think you're gonna see this too often out there in reality. And so in my opinion, that makes this a really, really wonderful, unique scene. All right, so we did our due diligence. We hand stitched this image together. We did a little bit of kind of creative patchwork on one side. We got it nice and sharp. We did a little bit of color tonality, and we have definitely gotten this image ready for the gallery wall. I hope you had fun on this little Photoshop adventure, and we'll see you in the next lesson.